So, good afternoon, everybody. It's so nice to be here. A very warm welcome to this seminar on climate change and mobility. My name is Naja Kleist. I'm a senior researcher here at DIIS, and I've been looking so much forward to this event. Not only is it the first in real life seminar since before the pandemic, so more than 2 years ago, and also because of the topic and our wonderful speakers. And when we started brainstorming on this event, we were like, oh, wouldn't it be great to have Lothar and Ingrid and Francis in the same room? And here we are. So wonderful to be here. A warm welcome to everybody. Also a warm welcome to those who might be watching the live stream or the video afterwards, because we are live streaming today. So the seminar today focuses on climate change and human mobility. It feeds into a new broad research initiative at DIIS that supports different kind of climate change research, and it also feeds into a research project that I and several colleagues here in the room are part of, called Governing Climate Mobility. So what we're doing today is to discuss the complex but important link between mobility and migration and climate change. And that is a difficult link to establish, but nonetheless really interesting to discuss. And what we want to do is to take a mobilities perspective on this. So that is to broaden the perspective away from alarmist scenarios of climate refugees in millions coming from the global south to the global north, which is this scenario that usually often pops up, at least when you talk about climate change and migration, and to tilt or to challenge this perspective with a focus on different kinds of mobility, so moving or staying in different ways. So that could be long distance migration for sure. That is not unimportant at all. It could also be short distance migration, so-called seasonal migration. It could be staying put, whether forced or voluntarily, so to speak. Or it could be commuting or fetching water. So all these different kinds of moving is what we'll be looking at today. And we'll pay attention to a larger set of questions, also stated in the invitation. So how do people cope through moving or staying in situations of climate change? What does a mobilities perspective add to climate change research? And finally, so what do we get, or what comes into mind? What do we see when we apply a mobilities perspective, and what may we miss when we do so? And so to discuss these questions, we have three wonderful speakers: Dr. Ingrid Boas, Dr. Lothar Smith, and Dr. Francis Jaravura. And from now on, it will just be Ingrid, Lothar, and Francis, the informal Danish way. And what will the program for the seminar is that I will introduce our speakers in a moment. Then we'll take a super brief round of presentations of the audience, make this workshoppy, because we also really want interactions for this. Then Ingrid will speak about climate mobilities and introduce the mobilities perspective. Francis will give us a case study on seasonal different kinds of migrations in Ghana. And Lothar will discuss notions, the implications of climate change research. And then we'll have a Q&A with you, hopefully very active. And there'll also be a small reception afterwards. So each speaker will speak for about 20 minutes, so to give some space for talking, but also keeping it brief. So when I prepared for the introduction on our speakers this morning, I realized or realized all the connections between our speakers. And one thing I would like to highlight here is that all three of them have contributed to a very important piece called Climate Migration Myths, with more than 20 co-authors that came out in 2019. So if you don't know that one, you should definitely look it up. So Ingrid Boas, whom we have here, is an associate professor at the Environment Policy Group at Wageningen University, and her research focuses on environmental change, mobilities, and governance. and also securitization of climate change-related migration and mobility. And she has done research all over the world, or in many places of the world, let's put it like this. And this year, Ingrid started a project that examines climate change-related mobility in borderlands to uncover how cross-border climate mobility is rooted in mobility histories, contexts, and understandings, which sounds super interesting and very relevant for the work that many of us do here. And Ingrid has published extensively on climate change, including a book on climate change and securitization of migration. And also, I'll just highlight one article that I found inspiration in myself, which is called A Mobilities Perspective on Migration in the Context of Environmental Change. And we have tried to get Ingrid to DIIS since 2019, actually. So again, before Corona, and now you're here. So a very warm welcome to you. It's also a great pleasure to introduce Frances Jaravura, who is in the moment a guest researcher here at DIIS. Frances is a lecturer of the SD Dumbo University of Business and Integrated Development Studies in Wa, Upper West Ghana, and works on different aspects of climate change and livelihoods, mobility, migration, gender relations, connectivity, etc. He also has a link to the Netherlands because he and Lothar have been working closely together. And Frances is also part of the governing climate mobilities program. And is busy working on papers in relation to that. And as he and Lothar also published a very interesting book chapter a few years ago on finding the right path, climate change and migration in northern Ghana. So a very warm welcome to you. And finally, least but not last, Dr. Lothar Smith from Radboud University. Lothar is a human geographer and works on different kinds of migration and mobilities, transnational processes, housing, funerals, a lot of very interesting different aspects, and is also very active in what you could call academic citizenship, so a lot of work in relation to that. And Lothar also has done a lot of work on Ghana, so with Frances and the Center for Migration Studies in Accra, Ghana. And in the moment, Lothar does research on the positionality of migrants and their collective involvement in development cooperation, also different places in the world, and is a part of a project called Transcode. So a very warm welcome also to you. So now a brief, super brief round of presentation. So that's one sentence each, your name and what you do. So for me it would be, I'm Naya Kleist. I work on migration mobilities in relation to climate change. Nothing more than that.
Yes, hello, I'm Lone. I'm a board member of Ghana Friends, and I was in Ghana in 2020, 2 years ago.
I'm Shelta Gache. I'm working on climate change, gender, and migration in Upper West and Eastern region of Ghana.
My name is Anna, and I work for the Danish Refugee Council as a teacher, Danish as second language, and now I'm retired and just a volunteer.
Well, I'm Richard Seyram from Ghana. I'm working on governance and climate change migration from the Upper West region of Ghana. Amen.
Hi, I'm Nina Nyberg Sørensen. I work at DIIS. I'm a migration expert venturing into climate change as a new area.
Hi, I'm Neil Webster, also at DIIS. I work on governance and moving into climate change and mobility from a governance perspective.
My name is Tommy Knudsen, and I'm just interested senior citizen.
Hi, my name is Lily Linnegård. I am a researcher here at DIIS working with climate change and response in terms of adaptation, finance, and also now mobility.
Hello, I am Adana from Ethiopia. So I work on governance and adaptation through migration.
Hi, I'm Mikkel. I'm from DIIS. I work on the politics and governance of climate change.
Hello everyone, my name is Kristina Deszkiewicz and I work with the International Organization for Migration on migration, environmental change, climate change and disaster risk reduction. Thank you.
My name is Jytte Ergaard. I'm a human geographer at University of Copenhagen, working on internal migration and small town development, and just started a project on climate change induced small town development and the governance of this situation. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Rachel. I'm from France. I'm studying a program in sustainable tourism development that involves mobilities and climate change as well.
Hi everyone, my name is Carolyn. I am working with sustainable projects at the Circular for Zero incubator at Novo Nordisk. So thanks for having me.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Zahra. I am from Somalia. I'm working with NAYA on, I'm doing research on gender and Somali diaspora humanitarianism. Thank you.
Okay, what a wonderful group. Let's give all of us a hand and then we'll go on. So Ingrid, now the floor is yours, please.
Mute. Right. Okay. However, de muis doet het niet. The mouse is not listening. It's more the mouse, or is it not?
We are having a technical problem.
Yeah. This one is on, eh?
So we just tested. It's like
oh, so like this.
15 minutes ago.
A bit new.
Okay, there we are.
Live. All right. I think it's the microphone is on as well, eh? Yeah. All right. Well, thanks again for the invitation, and yeah, happy to be here and also to learn from all the research and you're doing as well. What I'm going to talk about today is indeed a bit more context on this mobilities perspective, and also drawing on different examples from my own research, but also from research from other people I worked with. And this title is actually a title of a special issue that I think is coming out just today on climate mobilities, migration, immobilities, and mobility regimes in a changing climate, with the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies. With a nice collection of papers, I hope, at least. So just a bit of background. Indeed, as Naya, is I pronounced correctly? Yeah. was just saying that this, some years ago, together also with Lothar and Francis, we wrote this paper on climate migration myths. And that was indeed also to move away from this somewhat more alarmist take on the relationship between climate change and human migration, with the idea of unidirectional mass movement, direct linkages between climate change and migration. And that is still, I think, especially in policy, political speeches, etc., what you often see. I think in academia it has become increasingly less, though very often when people are somewhat new in the field, depending on their background, you see that it comes up again, also with myself. Like I had I come more from the environmental background, let's put it that way, and often people having that background tend to make somewhat more simple connections, while those with a human geography background already from the start think a bit like, hey, isn't this too simplistic discussion? But that's a bit how it, it's quite an interdisciplinary field, and I think how also the different perspectives and understandings emerge. So indeed, we have been arguing with quite a large group of researchers this research agenda on climate mobilities, and indeed, as Naya was saying, focusing on the diversity of movements. So let's not repeat that now. But in addition to that, is also to see that movement not per se something fully new, but actually embedded in existing practices of movement and existing rural-urban dynamics. The people still, also when climate change factors are involved, of course, decisions are still made on where you have connections, where you can work, where you can move to. So that is not per se very different. So it also intersects with these ongoing patterns and also histories of movement and particular understandings of particular identities that particular communities have. So for some, for instance, moving is already the current practice, like with pastoralist communities, while for others, moving away might feel more exceptional than for those who have already a very mobile livelihood. So it's trying to engage more, looking into sort of a broader dynamics and background. So in that sense, it also intersects with sort of wider discussions in migration literature, calling for sort of this de-exceptionalization of mobility and migration, not looking at something just as something out of the ordinary, something that should be stopped or managed, but rather to see how climate change is intersecting with everyday patterns of movement, but also how indeed creating new forms of immobilities, forced mobility, so quite a diversity, diverse sets of mobility patterns, and to look at that from a broader perspective. A critique that we sometimes get is that, this word mobility sort of makes it sort of less urgent than, for instance, the term climate refugees, and makes it sort of seem as if we think it's not important and that people are not deserving of protection. And that is, I think, not per se what we try to say. I think if you also look into Mimi Scheller's work, who does a lot with the concept of mobility justice, and looking also in uneven mobilities, questions of power and inequality and how that's all related to it. But of course, outside academia, that's sometimes a term more difficult to communicate. But for instance, now in the recent the Conference of the Parties, there was a speech. I think it was from the Prime Minister of Tuvalu, but it could have also been other member of government. But I found it interesting that in his speech he used the term climate mobility. So referring to what they need and more attention to climate mobility, and it didn't refer to climate refugees, etc. That is actually a term that is often rejected by the local population in Tuvalu, for instance, as then they feel that they are perceived as passive victims, and they actually want to define their climate futures themselves. So what I focus on more are 3 dimensions, depending on the time. I might skip some, but the relation between mobilities and immobilities, and also a bit reflecting on our biases to focus on forced dimensions of mobility, intersections with other socio-material mobilities, and the role of climate mobility regimes and acts of contestation. So first, climate mobilities and immobilities. So very often when we think about that there has been a climate event or another type of disaster, we think about chaos, displacement, forced mobility, and that's what a lot of attention goes to, which is of course in several cases also justified. But often there's also an interest, for instance, this was an image already from 10 years back from a research institute in Germany, giving a figure of hotspots of climate migration and suggesting this image of that there's sort of a mass movement across countries, across continents. So that was sort of what a lot of the attention went to, and somewhat of a bias also in funding mechanisms, etc., for us to focus on and to study. Well, in practice, we, for instance, also see many cases of immobilities. So here, this is a picture from Bangladesh in the island of Qutb Dia. And here behind you see a large hole that there used to be an embankment, but already 7 years ago or so it got broken by a cyclone, and many times they attempted to fix it, but yeah, because of different reasons, it often broke again and again. So every time sort of there's high tides, the houses are sort of in the water, and then when it's dry, it looks like this. So that's a bit how the situation looks like. But a lot of people still continue to stay here. I met a family, a woman who does sort of bring her children often to this area, which is called Chokeria, which is on the mainland and a bit more hillier space. So they think, okay, they're safe from the water. So there she brings her children to her sister-in-law, who lives in this temporary sort of house constructed against some of these others sort of house. And she brings her children there when the water stays high too long, or when they know that sort of a bad period is coming. But then she goes back because her husband, he works there, he's a fisher, and it's hard to move away. So you also see that it's not per se so easy also to decide to relocate, and people stay put also in situations that seem quite serious. Like here, so people continue living there, and then, for instance, go like this to the main road in order to get to school. And of course, there have been a lot of protests to ask the government to fix the embankment. So a lot of sort of complexities there at play. But here, I think this also shows sort of, in a way, also lack of options to move away. They're worried that they don't have a job if they move to this hillier area, that there are not a lot of jobs around. So that's also why they stay. But many researchers have also been looking at forms of voluntary immobility and actually sort of resistance towards relocation. For instance, Hanne Wiegel, this PhD researcher in our group, she looked in the village of Villa Santa Lucia in Patagonia. That was hit by a mudslide, and then the government actually wanted to relocate the village, just not very far away, and also had subsidies at place, etc., to support people. But people just didn't want to move. They feel like, no, we live here, and our identity is that we're used to live with risk, and we don't want to move away. This is a part of who we are, and we are just staying. And Carol Verbotko, in the special issue that's now coming out, she wrote on what she calls anti-displacement, with forms of resistance in the islands of Tuvalu, where people are constructing with sand and all kind of creative ways to protect their houses, etc., because they don't want to move away or relocate. So it's quite a lot of research is showing sort of the strong attachment to place. So that's also where a lot of attention is going to. And it's not just in Global South, but also, for instance, in the Netherlands, in Limburg, where we had the floods last summer. Their master students just did a lot of research, and also, seeing how people, after being displaced, went back home. And even if the risks may come again, people feel attached to the place, also don't know very much where to go to, because other areas in the Netherlands may in the future also be at risk. Houses, it's difficult to sell your house, of course, if you live in a risk area. So there's a lot of complexities there. And you also see people moving back. This was again in Bangladesh, where there had been a lot of erosion, not because of climate change actually, but river erosion, like 3 kilometers or so had been lost. At 20 years there was no proper embankment. Now it was finally being built, and a lot of people were moving back and coming back and feeling, okay, we can start up our businesses again and build houses, etc. So you saw that dynamic as well. Skipping this one. So just to sum up this first part, so you see that there's somewhat of a bias in research towards mobility, and especially this crisis-like form. But you see a lot of research is increasingly showing that we should also look into immobilities, forced immobility, but also immobility in the sense of showing resistance and actually sort of as a form of empowerment and contestation. And also that, life trajectories may entail both moments of mobility and immobility, and that there are no clear dichotomy, basically. So the second point is how also climate mobilities is of course also intersecting with a lot of other forms of mobilities. So I focus a bit more, I go now to an example of in Kenya, where I focus especially on the connections with rural-urban dynamics and digital flows. So this is in Kenya, in Laikipia, where I focus on the Maasai. Since sort of colonial times, so the end of colonial times, still the private landholders still own large pieces of land, or that has been transformed sometimes into wildlife reserves. The pastoralists, even though they see it as their ancestral land, have often not get access to that land, and often are quite restricted in where they can graze and move with their cattle. At the same time, it's in the context of climate change, it's quite sort of uncertainty about when it's dry, when it's raining. When I was there, it was actually quite sort of much more rain than there was normally. Now has been a very long drought again. And then people, the pastoralists also want to enter these restricted areas of grazing. In the same time, you have people moving to cities because of education opportunities, etc. So I'm looking, it's a quite sort of a complex picture actually of all what's going on. And I'm looking into this role of the digital there. Here you, for instance, saw how so normally when the pastoralists, when they saw each other, you connect. They called it Syrian. You connect when you see each other from where should we go? Where is it dry? Where is there enough pasture? And this was increasingly becoming sort of connected with information shared via phone or via WhatsApp, especially with the younger people who didn't want to join anymore because they had to teach or had other type of jobs, but still connected via WhatsApp to share information. For instance, this was a short video they shared. How do you say springhanen? I forgot. Oh, it's not working here. Well, anyways, it's a springhanen, weet je nog? Wat? Yeah, okay. Grasshoppers, yeah. Yeah, there was this, they were there when I was there. There was quite a big thing in the news back then. Locust, locust invasion. And sharing that and giving pictures of how it looks at home, whether or not people could go back with the cattle or not. So they were exchanging a lot of information, and assessment of the nature and the drought, etc. was in one night by what you could see directly, but also by what was shared sort of digitally. And also it allowed those who moved to the city, like for instance this businessman still had a lot of sort of big herds in Laikipia, and he managed that via phone. So when I tried to do an interview with him, he was constantly interrupted and had to call and exchange information, and also on the direction to go to in the context of where there were rains and not. So you see how these mobilities are becoming, it's also quite difficult to research in a sense. It's quite complex, and a lot of things are coming together. But it's good, to look at those connections to understand what's really going on, and not to have a too simple assumption of that is, for instance, only climate change. So then the final point is on the climate mobility regimes. So in the special issue we just published, we focus a bit more on that, on how a particular sort of political relations, governance regimes seek to steer and shape the relationships between mobility and climate change. And an example of that, to exemplify, is in a paper the work that's being done in the small island states. There's a lot of the discussions in the climate change negotiations, in the media, etc. They often focus on what's happening in the small island states. There are a lot of discourses and particular frames, and they shape, and we see that sort of as functioning as part of a sort of a global regime, climate mobility regime. And often these small island states are framed as sort of lost to climate change. In the end, everybody will have to relocate, and that is also shaping what donors will do, what type of aid they provide. And this paper is quite a nice paper to read, actually. I think argues that because of that, there's too little attention to adaptation, to what how people can adapt in the small island states. And that they also see that this is part of a sort of a new neo-colonial dynamic that, sort of via these often Western-based framings, it's sort of decided what the future of these small island states will be, rather than people themselves deciding how their futures will look like. And then it's also about acts of resistance, seeking to go against these powerful climate mobility regimes. Maybe the example here on the right, that is actually a community from you have the Climate Pacific Warriors from the small island states. So there's an activist group who seek to actually go back to their indigenous culture and also the indigenous practices of mobility, to show, hey, actually we have a voice in this, and we actually want to be heard and listened to. So they went with canoes, which was a mobility practice that was sort of forbidden in colonial times, and now sort of coming back, and they show actually through practices of mobility, they went to block a coal ship, and raising awareness for climate change mitigation action. So there's a lot of resistance and contestation actually taking place about how we should frame these relations, and also who actually should determine the governance of the relationship between climate change and mobilities. For sake of time, I'll just go to the final slide. So to conclude the research agenda on climate mobilities. So on the one hand, it's about this dynamic and plural understanding of the relationship between climate change, of immobility and mobility, and also the intersections with other forms and types of mobilities. It's about the interplay with climate mobility regimes and the role of power and politics in this context, which I think is important, as our field has often focused on, more sort of local case studies, but this broader political focus is somewhat missing and could sort of become more visible, I think, in the field of study. And better understanding of the ways those affected navigate these regimes, and see in that sense mobility and immobility as political acts, and not just as Ranabir Samadar said, see the migrant as a stark figure of the outsider caught in various push and pulls, which I think some time ago also has been the focus more in our field, focusing a lot on driver's model, push and pulls, and I think there's a turn now increasingly to see it more through this political lens. I think that's it then.
So much.
All right.
That was really, really great. Now I give the floor to Frances, who will speak about the gold rush and savanna migration and mobilities. So we need the next.
Yes, now we should be on.
Enter. Okay. Okay, that's one, right? Yes. So I'm to present on a case study in Ghana, and coming down from a theoretical presentation, I'll take you a bit down to some empirical stuff. So I present on a paper I call the Gold Rush. So looking at, the mic is off. Is this off? Yes. Can you hear me, Lothar? Okay. Nice. Oh. Okay. So I talk about diversifying spaces of migration in the savannah of Ghana, and the savannah of Ghana is the driest part of the country in Ghana. So of course, like we've already heard from Ingrid, when it comes to climate change, the focus has often been on how vulnerable populations, particularly rural populations, are going to migrate either to urban centers or migrate across international borders, and particularly across continents. So, of course, migration has always been an important strategy for rural people to cope with different kinds of stress, and that also including climate. But the issue has always been how scholars and the media have tried to portray this, and talking about mass migrations, rather than enabling us focus on the more substantive and more important issues. So rather than a broader approach, as I've already said, many people, some scholars in the media have pushed the agenda of looking at what we call climate refugees, and then internationally irregular migration, people crossing in their big numbers to Europe and America. But in fact, when we look at the literature, what we find out is that much of migration happening in Africa is internal. And in essence, 94% of African migration across the oceans takes place on a regular form, which is very, very important. And 80% of people with the intention to migrate do not actually plan to leave the continent. They rather plan to go to destinations within the continent, which then we also see that African migrants mostly also move within their sub-regions. So those within West Africa would probably go to Ghana, Burkina Faso, and Ivory Coast, and those in southern Ghana would probably move around, South Africa, Zimbabwe, you know. So when then we turn our attention to internal migration, unfortunately, we still focus on existing major rural to urban migration forms, which really does not allow us to understand the dynamics of climate change and migration. So this is very evident in Ghana when we see the literature and the media focusing their attention on urban areas as recipients of climate migrants and how they will overcrowd the city and make governance of the city very problematic. So from the savannah, with the colonial regime and even now, the major patterns have always been from the savannah towards the south, where the vegetation and climate is much better, soils are much better, there is also more opportunities in the urban areas there. So how do we look beyond these imaginative narratives that there will be millions of people migrating from Africa trying to reach Europe and to make their lives possible? So now I'm currently focusing on how local patterns of mobility are changing or responding to climate change. And my work has been, particularly focused on rural migration and Navrongo for now. And then I also do look at these forms of migration in the Upper West. Today I talk about the forms of migration in Upper East from Navrongo. So we may be able to then see these villages as villages of hope, as my respondents make me understand. What is the savannah like? The savannah has people mostly living in the rural areas, and 92% of these are farmers, mostly depending on rain-fed agriculture. So in spite of a huge potential to have irrigation, just 2% of this potential has been realized according to the World Food Program. And this can be seen as a government failure. So autonomous irrigation schemes dominate the landscape, but these hardly bring any benefits. So of course, people rear animals, and most households just have 5 to 10 sheep or goat or pigs and cattle. In fact, owning a cow means you're a rich person. So you have 2 cows in a household, yeah, you are respected. Then the savannah also houses much of the poor people in Ghana. It actually accounts for 67.7% of all rural poor in Ghana. So unfortunately, it is also the region that has seen a decline in the efforts to achieve a better life. And climate change in the savannah, which already has a precarious environment and already experiences high variability. So what research has shown is that temperatures have risen by 1 degree Celsius from 1960 to 1990, and rainfall has reduced by 20%. And this is a lot. So of course, we now see some improvements in rainfall, but there is still increasing variability. But the unique feature of the savannah is that it has one rainfall season, so all the risks are just concentrated in one. So what I try to see is to study 2 villages in Navrongo and to find out how they are responding to climate change and how this is probably changing patterns of migration. So these villages point to a new pattern of migration to a neighboring town, which is 2 hours away, traveling at 100 kilometers per hour. And this place is Tumu, which is just in the next region, was and is still a big forest reserve area and has amazing rainfall regime, though it's a single maximum rainfall. But it has much more rainfall and much more reliable rainfall. So focus groups narrate to me that they always knew that this area in Tumu was very good when they were children, but they could not migrate there at the time because it was too forested and had so many wild animals. So they would stay away. And then also, the opportunities for farm labor was much less. But over time, so now they have this potential, which is also enabled by government and also the private sector in opening up the forest areas that is around the reserve. So now we also have people coming from the south who had already migrated to the south, now coming back to this new hub, which now produces 30% of Ghana's food. So up in Tumu. Then we also have people from Navrongo going there straight. So it's a return migration and a remigration, or you go straight from the south to the new zone. So yes, so this reserves up there, and so the village, the town is just a bit above, and I think it really enjoys its climate because of the Molly Game Reserve and also the Chelle Game Reserves. And so now we have many more people going there to make farms. So how does this dangerous territory turn to farmlands that suddenly are safe? So a respondent told me, we all knew of the good rains in Tumu long ago, but it was all bush and full of dangerous animals. We feared it. Some said there were lions, others said buffaloes, but certainly something was killing the farmers and the shanat pickers. But now it's opened up by the hunters and tractors. So it means that governance regimes and also investments in agricultural sector can influence how we utilize existing resources to adapt to a changing climate. So I have another story from a friend, Jogobu. It's a friend I met during Christmas last year, and we had a beer together, and then the stories came up. So he actually saw his people eating well when he returned home to vote. So migrants in southern Ghana would often come home to cast their votes for the presidential and parliamentary elections, so that at least their member of parliament knows about them and their households. So if there were to be any gifts or any government projects, they will have their name on the book. So he came home and then he realized that there was suddenly enough food in the house and they were eating well, and there was still some in the silo. Then he realized that his younger brother's migration to Tumu was far better than his migration to southern Ghana, and he had spent so many years already. So he then spoke to people around who confirmed the truth of the situation in Tumu. So he decided to come home and then join his brother in Tumu. And he tells me, like the focus groups, that many more Northerners from Navrongo are returning home to go to this new found gold so they can enjoy and be close home. I also spoke to a seasonal migrant, and he used to migrate seasonally to the south. Then one time he migrated, and then there was poor rainfall and also some drought, so they had no work. But then a friend called to inform them of plenty work in Tumu, so they decided to migrate back, and that was the beginning of their local migration. So we see also that people now go with their families to work seasonally in this new agricultural hub. And some go with their children, and they stay to close to 6 months, and some stay more permanently. I had a little focus group discussion and tried to find out some of the push factors that would send people off to Tumu. So you would see climate variables playing very important role, and when you compare it to the other side, then you can see how reliability of rainfall is really very important. Then you also see people talking of the shortening of the rain season in Navrongo, and then in southern Ghana where they are, but they claim that in Tumu is still quite good. And when we assess long-term rainfall data, we realize that Tumu has a much better rainfall and less variability. And this is always attributed to the forest around it. I tried to look at other factors, of course, and I found that with soil fertility, it is poorer in Navrongo, and that of the Tumu is much fertile. But when you look at those who come from southern Ghana, they tell you that the soil fertility in southern Ghana is much more fertile than the Tumu area. So that is not important for them to migrate. But in the cocoa farming areas in eastern region, what we see is that there's a decline in rainfall. So what they say is, I can say is true right away, because we have done long-term analysis of temperature and rainfall there. So it's affecting cocoa production, where mostly northerners are in charge of the farms. They work for the southern farmers. So then some of them come home to the agricultural hub that has just been found. Others go off to the new gold sites that have been discovered. Because digging gold has been restricted to southern Ghana. But recently, Chinese companies have ventured northwest and created some of these places. And some of these returned migrants also have their own galamsey, that is illegal gold mining factories. So in conclusion, we can say that it's very important to move away from simplistic narratives about climate migration nexus, and of course, to try to dissipate views that talk about mass migration from Africa to Europe and America. It is crucial that we also focus on how existing patterns of migration are influenced by climate change, what new patterns emerge, how are old patterns changing. Do we see intensification? Do we also see people changing direction? Perhaps even more innovative and sustainable ways of dealing with future climate change among rural people could be migration within the very ecological fragile zones that we always thought would produce loss of out-migration. Even those zones could provide opportunities for people to survive and to adapt. I asked the question, what extent climate policies ignore or include rural areas as both origin and recipients of climate migrants? So in relation to this, Ghana's migration policy has amazingly also captured rural areas as out-migration areas and focusing on urban areas. Yes, so I think that's where I leave it. Okay.
Thank you so much, Francis. That was excellent, and excellent time management. You would even have a couple of minutes left. And one of the very interesting things here in relation to mobilities is also how you linked different mobilities, like not only of people but also animals and tractors in Tumu becoming a place migration hub. So thank you very much for that. So now our last speaker, Lothar, will turn us conceptual again and talk about considerations of climate change and human mobilities research.
Great. And let me, yes, it's on. Can you hear me? Yeah, good, great. Afternoon, everyone, and great to be here. I think if I hear this is the first seminar, then this must be an extra exciting moment to sort of get back into action and sort of also have the conversations that I think we also need to have, which will follow after our 3 presentations. So I look as much forward to that as I think to the 2 presentations of my 2 colleagues, and then to plow you through what is possibly more conceptual and certainly less exciting, because I will not have brilliant pictures to support my story as much as my 2 colleagues did. Nonetheless, so what I want to talk about is climate change and human mobility as a research topic in social science, and to ask ourselves, okay, so where do we take it from here? So you've heard from Ingrid, of course, a plea, I think, for mobilities rather than migration as a way forward, because it sort of assumes much more flexibility, if you like, and it decouples migration to issues, right? So it doesn't necessarily make that link. That's one element, I think. And then I think what Francis has really sort of illuminated very richly with his accounts is also to say that we need to look at different scales in understanding how climate change sort of is effectuated, and how it has both slow onsetting processes and slow movements and shifts in how societies construct themselves, as well as more dramatic changes, which I think also really came through in what Ingrid was telling us, and indeed to be wary, I think, also of considering and conceiving certain places as lost. I think that is a very important message to sort of take home. What I want to do in this paper is to address possible directions for research on climate change as relates to human mobility from a generic social sciences example. I'm trying to press buttons, but I don't think it's working. I'm probably pressing the wrong button. Which one do I do? So I pointed it. Oh, that's beautiful. Lovely. I didn't know I had wonderful stuff there. All right, great. So here we go. So much for technology. Right, so what I want to focus on is a couple of things. First, to give you a brief introduction as to sort of, you know, how do we take it from here, and particularly to focus then on two fields which have sort of sided with each other but not always been on happy terms. On the one hand, the field of migration turning towards mobility, and on the other hand, the field of livelihood studies, which have connected and disconnected at many times, and I think we're still sort of at a phase where we're quite undecided as to sort of what perspective to take. For instance, if you link it to the SDGs, right, the Sustainable Development Goals, who comes in where in sort of understanding the kind of perspectives, governance perspective that is very much prevalent. I'm going to be very limited in my insights that I want to borrow from our field, the work that I did together with Francis, but there's just a few points that I want to raise in order to help us get to the discussion, which is to think about ways that we can move forward. I'm very unfortunate with this button. Oh, I'm pointing now. That's also nice. Not what I want to do today. There. Okay, great. Here we go. It's important to understand possibly why I want to sort of, you know, bring these two fields together. The fields of, on the one hand, livelihood studies, and on the other hand, that of migration studies. I think the point is here that both fields have been very instrumental in current social sciences approaches to climate change, but the question is whether and how they can continue to play an insightful role in climate change research. And so so what I try to do in this paper or in this presentation is to capture the links the two fields bring to help develop at least a few notions, and I think we should take this into discussion, of a research approach that on the one hand explores general dynamics in approaches to life in general, but also takes into cognition various modes of associated forms and notions of social spatial belonging, because these are clearly elements that really sort of come forward. The notion of belonging we cannot ignore. I think it's very much an essential element of how we need to understand when mobility but also immobility occurs. So, and this approach then also helps to avoid considering the dynamics at hand from an issues perspective only, right? From notions of governance models that fail to attain particular development levels, or from another kind of problem-oriented approach. Generally, mobility of people, or more particularly migration of people, is often seen as a failing of governance mechanisms. And I think we're shortchanging the people themselves who are engaged with this. So, yes, in one time. Turning first briefly to the livelihood studies, which of course we're all at least familiar with, or somewhat familiar with, some very familiar with. In the case of livelihood studies, an orientation on concepts such as empowerment, agency, and the role of social networks, and the various forms of capital helps us give direction to bottom-up approaches, which is good because it helps us understand how household decisions are made with regard to, for instance, something like income generation. And this is notably important for those in unstable or even precarious situations, for whom return to own investments of labor and other capital may often be uncertain, variable, and at least sort of always on the edge. So the livelihoods approach, by focusing on assets of social units such as households or extended families as social units, and their ability to maximize their use of these resources, then also gives recognition to their ability to survive and the ways they can even seek to improve their lives. So it's not only about survival, but it's also about sort of looking at opportunities to improve these lives. So what this implies then is an analysis of the kinds of capital people hold, entitlement, their ability to apply these through certain capabilities, agency and endowments into particular activities. And this remains, I think, important to date in studies for developmental interventions, and see, for instance, the model that is still very much cited, the DFID livelihoods framework. But as a far cry from macro-oriented structuralist and modernistic approaches that preceded it, which had sought to overcome and shift into the mainstream all so-called marginal, suboptimal, and informal economies, this was a solid step in the right direction of a people-centered approach. It gave, notably, people the chance, to, both in rural and urban domains, to express their rationales, their considerations, their plans, and thereby also their voice. However, two matters need to be probed. And the first, this is where too many buttons here. There we go. please move. What's that? I've never had this. Great. Two issues need to be probed. The first derives from a simple question: when and where can the state be expected to play a role in the lives of its citizens? So even for governments who lack certain financial means to provide basic amenities to all their citizens, the excuse does not apply that they need to not look for alternatives. For instance, less capital-intensive modalities or partnerships with other actors to help improve the lives of their citizens. And while we cannot maintain the naive perspective that governments can care equally about all segments of their population, this does not mean that they should be ignored in external interventions, for instance from international agencies who seek to introduce bottom-up development interventions. So at some point in time, these need to at least align and possibly be sort of usurped or taken on board by state institutional mechanisms to ensure a certain sustainability. And the second issue is that with a livelihoods approach, we also need to ask whether we're not actually somewhat celebrating, if you like, the marginal. Notably, when we look at the larger picture in absolute terms, avoiding fundamental discussions on inequality at more aggregate societal and geographical scales by zooming in too much on the microeconomy, on the everyday lives of those we study. Notwithstanding these 2 points of critique, livelihood studies have provided highly useful insights into the complexities of people's lives, and what is thereby relatively well understood are notions of intentionality and underlying rationality in the lives of people, as operationalized in many different ways through complex strategies of risk diversification that comes out of multiple income sources. And I think we've seen great illustrations already from Francis in the prior presentation. So with strong inclinations to maximize opportunities for people, notably the poor, insight in their intentionality often forms the basis for all sorts of developmental interventions, such as, of course, the Sustainable Development Goals. Turning to another field, watch this, haha. I went in one go, I'm still sort of enjoying this. The second field that I want to link up here is that of migration studies. And what I want to do is move beyond, let's say, the conceptually entrapped dichotomies that still often persist in migration studies. And I think this is exactly what Ingrid was also pointing to, and which is also part of the myths article that we sort of brought out. Alike to livelihood studies, migration studies have, notably in the past, also premised themselves very strongly on rational choice, initially limited to all sorts of external elements influencing people's choices between, for instance, two competing labor markets. Later elements also included more personally derived and motivational elements, such as more macro-structural push and pull elements, we just saw a few examples of this, but also keep and repel factors. So the latter, for instance, also returns in something like the thresholds approach, which we developed in Nijmegen, but also can be discerned in the work of other scholars. And I think, for instance, the work of Jürgen Carling on aspirations to migrate very much sits very well with that. So understanding then migration as an integral notion of life, with all the adventure that this can bring, and not only as an instrument applied at the grassroots by the poor at times of sheer desperation, and thereby also then as a failing of the state, is something which has also emanated out of the research which Francis and others in northern Ghana have sort of shown very strongly, which is looking at mobility responses to the onset of climate change, but not only at that moment but also before. So it's a much more complex story. Let me now bring you to a bit of Ghana to help sort of also expose what this then implies in terms of the kinds of approaches that is there. So for this I draw on a paper that Francis and I wrote, which you were actually also referring to, for which many thanks. It's a paper that sort of looks at sort of the different pathways to different trajectories that people can follow in understanding, let's say, what steps to take. And what is rich about that paper, I think, and this draws heavily on your work, Francis, is the fact that it doesn't assume that mobility comes forth out of a failing of local circumstances, supporting agriculture, rain-fed agriculture in particular, but it can actually show some very interesting opposing conclusions that do not fit with, let's say, the rationale that we would like to apply, with the intuitive results that we would expect. So the first conclusion to sort of put a focus on is that, unlike the prevailing idea that climate change hastens out-migration from rural regions in arid zones of the world, we can also see counterintuitive choices to return to rural communities. This may, for instance, occur when prior climate change related events such as drought had already led to increased migration to cities and towns, and then a further aggravating economic situation in urban regions due to other shocks, or also because of climate, may result in an overly strong competition for available employment, whereby some may choose to return to their village for some time to reduce the fixed costs that are simply associated with urban life. Sometimes it's just not worth the effort. This movement does not align well with policy thinking at national and international levels that very much focus on sedentary, so-called trapped populations, people who increasingly struggle to move out of their localities even if their livelihoods are in a constant jeopardy. Rather, our findings showcase perpetual and regional mobility, both in and outflowing for rural regions, weighing income opportunities in the city with options. And I was really listening to your brilliant story about a new region in the global in the north of Ghana, Francis, and asking myself, okay, but how different is that from, let's say, the past seasonal migration that you used to have between, let's say, the two seasons, right? The two seasons of the tropical part of Ghana versus the more arid savanna part. So is it a new opportunity or is it actually more of the same? I think we have to ask ourselves these hard questions. Second, it's important to stress that immobility is sometimes also a chosen strategy. In our work, some of the respondents made clear arguments that they were better off diversifying their income-generating activities in the village or near the village, rather than going off to some nearby town or even farther away. They based this decision on prior experiences, notably during early years of drought, but also narrated that it was not only about opportunities elsewhere, but also about the need to take into cognition the circumstances allowing return migration, which includes simply readjusting to local life, which is possibly not as exciting as in the big city. So particularly for younger adults who returned, the experiences of going to the city and then coming back again and readjusting to the norms and constraints of a much more close society really meant that they were struggling with sort of finding motivation but not ready to move back to the city. So you find people trapped, let's say, in a moment of indecision, not sure where they fit. You could, call them people really on the move, in a perpetual space of immobility, actually, because of their indecisiveness as to sort of what future to pursue. So, bringing us to the third conclusion that's here, internal migration is as much about rural to rural migration as it is about rural to urban migration. I think, Francis, you've given that point. You've punctuated it very well in your presentation, so I think I will leave it there. One of the points that I think is important, and somebody was mentioning it also in her work, is that we put emphasis very much on movement between rural and primate cities. And we forget that there's a second order of cities, and towns, I should say, that is actually increasingly important. I believe it was you who sort of pointed that out. And I think this is very important because the emphasis so much in demographic studies and studies of, let's say, this transition from rural informal economies into, let's say, urban massive cities assumes that there's nothing in between those two spaces, and actually there's all sorts of things happening. And in fact, if you look at the evidence, we see that towns in Ghana, for instance, like Wa and Tamale, which are in the north, and which people may not know as well as, for instance, Kumasi and Accra, are actually growing at a much faster pace. That means something, and we cannot ignore that fact. But we need to ask ourselves also what that fact implies. So is it a shifting sort of sense of possibilities, or does climate change perhaps also bring about new forms of agency that we had not seen? Yeah. Turning to discussion. So the hard question I was asked was, okay, so where do we take it from here? So where do we go in terms of let's say the kind of research that we should be doing? And of course, this is a dreamland. You get to fantasize about all the research you can do. So I'm going to pop up something at the end for some wicked research that we should be doing. But obviously, that's sort of dreaming out loud. But I think in order to get there, we need to be realistic also about sort of what the key elements are that we need to sort of focus on. So this final part of my presentation delves into some considerations for future research that really builds on these two fields that I've tried to sort of interlink. And the question we need to ask is sort of what conceptual route we need to take in social sciences with climate change as a topic. What is imperative to better understand, and what conceptual approach will be able to sort of support this? So first, there's the orientation on physical developments, as climate change is typically and often configured, which fails to recognize already existing modes of perpetual mobility and immobility, that in all but the most isolated of rural and depressed regions you will be able to find. And this is also the first conclusion that Francis and I gave when we reported that people might actually choose to return to their rural communities of origin at times of aggravated conditions. Whilst that conclusion rested very logically on a sort of translocal perspective, an outlook that links mobility decision-making to multiple sites and in the pursuit of sustainable livelihoods, so in that sense progressive, because we're not looking at people being either here or there. We're not looking at, let's say, singular subunits, but we're looking at the connectivity between these. At the same time, it fails to understand that such an approach still inherently considers there to be discrete spaces, which is urban and rural. And even when a multi-sited livelihood approach is taken, this remains. So various strategies in this kind of thinking is still linked to either the rural or the urban domain, and it's only the net sum of this which is considered then to be, let's say, mobile. And what this fails to understand is how various decisions of individuals or larger units, such as households, actually make continual real-time connections between the rural and the urban domains. So that sort of makes the space even more fuzzy, and therefore also less clear, and obviously from a policy perspective, I guess, less desirable, because imagine you being a city planner and listening to this conversation. This does not make you happy, of course, because you're getting flexibility in a total form. But I think it's important to understand this, because then it helps to understand that, let's say, there's a constant dynamic mobility strategy. And for instance, even with something like agriculture and people growing crops, when there are early signs of the crop production, the productivity, I should say, falling below the levels expected, that is already a moment in which cognitively other ideas sort of crop up. Excuse the pun. So where other sort of alternatives start to emerge, which then leads to adjustments of strategies for these households, right? To connect it also to the urban and to see if the things can be offset in a certain way. It means that there's a continual appraisal of these different options, and I think this doesn't apply to all. I think there's still sort of discrete processes and discrete activities that have a certain temporal dimension, but it's clearly very dynamic. So the second point to draw here, and for that I turn to to a much more complex situation, is that of the demographic situation which we're facing, in particular in Africa. Africa is a continent, not a country, so it's very hard to sort of sketch a generic picture. But I think that what is irrelevant here is that this continent is facing a much more complex situation than possibly any other continent, because of the fact that the way the rural agenda for sustainable development can be developed in a way that is actually going to be a success by some standard, needs to respond to aggravating climate change in a response to demographic conditions that are omnipresent. I can configure, or I can see three particular elements. So at first, there's still a large rural population. We need to accept that, and we need to say that yes, while there is a slow urbanization of the African continent overall, it's not at the level where we see other continents being. So that is something to take on board. Second, the movement between rural and urban zones, as already amply described, is complex, and it's premised more in seasonal, temporary movement than really in permanent kinds of situations. And this is also has much to do with the fact that it's not because of industrialization and a changing dynamic of what the city can provide that this process has sort of come about, but rather it's out of more spontaneous and constantly dynamic and fluid notions of what might be available in the city and how to sort of play out on that you see this sort of, this movement towards cities. What this implies then, and this is something that I argue with Paul Habing and Michael Aliber in a paper that's forthcoming, is that what we need to be careful of when it comes to, for instance, looking at agriculture or the rural agenda, and it's not the same as agriculture, is that we should be careful with developmental agendas that seek to revamp rural economies, premised in notions that current agricultural practices and their gradual decline are essentially the result of risk-averse and low-capital approaches, which then need to be offset with state-led, technocratic, commercial and climate-proof kinds of interventions. Coming to my final point, trying to stay in the time. Finally, and excuse me, I should have turned here. So there, too much text. Coming to sort of, so the final point here is then what does this imply for the way we should move forward? As I said before, this is where I got the chance to dream, and I guess this would be one way to really think about sort of, okay, what do we need in order to really fully understand the complexity? Obviously, from a social sciences perspective, we only have certain input in a very complex discussion around climate change, of which we only have partial insights, because some of these questions are simply geophysics. It's about, let's say, soil fertility. It's about what kind of crops you can grow. So we can't be good at everything, right? But we can contribute. So what should we be contributing? Well, if we can assume that the best kind of research in which money is not a problem would be a transdisciplinary research that really sort of goes on for a longer term, not talking about 3 or 4 years here, which is typical for, let's say, European funds, but really 10 years or longer, then in that kind of context, it's possible to look at demographic changes, to look at geographies, excuse me, of mobility and changing physical conditions that are linked to climate change, and so on and so forth. And then from there on determine what our role is in this. And for social sciences, this is to look at, let's say, kinds of processes of emancipation and participation of local populations in these processes. So where does the local population come in? Can we consider them to be, if you like, citizen scientists? Are we ready to engage with local populations to such an extent that we consider them to be knowledgeable about the things that are ongoing, but where we can also emancipate them with processes they may not be fully aware of, or where there's a certain limited cognition of the complexity of the processes they're very much part of? This, I think, is quite a question, because obviously what it implies then is the question, you know, is what we're looking at, is it an applied field, and should we be looking at how we can sort of support governance models and governance orientations, or should we instead be looking at more sort of fundamental questions of what we're sort of really are on about, because it's already so complex to look at? Well, I guess, as we've also argued in Boas et al., the acceptance of human mobility in response to climate change as linked to all manner of other impacting drivers of migration, if you want to call it that, as it is a new normal, and it should not be seen as an exception. I think that should be our starting point. And with that, let me end with this happy balloon. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lothar, and for taking us dreaming about the perfect research project. So we now have time for discussion. Before we start that, do anybody need a small break, or are you okay in going on? Yeah, so let's take 5, but not more than that. So thank you so much again to Ingrid, Francis and Lothar. That were really wonderful presentations, and really speaking very well to each other, I think. And I could also hear that from, just listening to people. And I mean, a lot of things struck me. And one thing was, of course, like challenging common sense perceptions about climate change and migration and mobility. As also expected in a way, but you did it really well. And one thing that also stood out, I think, is to focus on different kinds of immobilities. And that's something that I would personally like to hear more about. So how to conceptualize immobility, and is it like just immobile, or are there also kind of different mobilities involved in staying somewhere? Another thing was, as Lothar also said, the emphasis on scales, so temporal scales, spatial scales, intensities of climate change and of mobility, that I also found really important. And then also what went through all 3 of your presentations, these different intersecting and interacting regimes, so regimes of climate change, regimes of mobility and migration on local, regional and global scales also. I have a lot of other questions, but I would, this is supposed to be interactive, so I would perhaps just like to start by you, first of all, to get you up here, actually. Sorry, I forgot that. And then for you to start to reflect on the question about immobility, but perhaps also on each other's presentations, and then we'll open up the floor for discussion. And yeah, so then there's always this thing of getting all this stuff back on again.
Okay.
Yes.
Who wants to start?
I can say something on the immobility thing. Yeah. So I think so indeed that the point you just make, it's on, huh?
It should be on.
Yeah. On that, indeed, still with staying in place, you see a lot of different forms of mobilities also at play. I think that the example I showed with that there's the family who lived in Qutb Dia on the island, where there was a lot of constant sort of flooding. That still they had sort of a temporary strategy that the children would go to the mainland and then would go back. So they have sort of different forms of coping while staying in place. And there's also quite a nice PhD thesis from Susie Blondin, who also published quite a few articles, also in our special issue, on in Tajikistan, how people's daily mobilities, for instance, of getting to a market area or getting to work, is actually becoming quite complicated because of in a way, climatic changes, but also other environmental changes, like the roads are getting blocked, etc. So she looks in sort of places of immobilities and mobilities, but in a very sort of everyday life setting, so indeed it looks into these various dimensions, and it's maybe that's maybe what I had a question also, but maybe you should leave that for later.
Yeah, so if you take the mobility round, and then I'll get back to questions within between you. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy to build on what you were saying. I think what I found striking about something you said in your presentation, Ingrid, is you were relating to the example of the so-called trapped islands, right? Those the islands that are basically lost cases. We should give up on them. The Tuvalus, right?
Yeah.
We should accept them, and this is obviously very good for donors, because then they can sort of appeal to the peoples to provide more to help these people out. But this victimization, I think, is what is important to sort of offset, and to speak of immobility as also a choice, and not only as, let's say, an involuntary process. Now, this, of course, very much depends from place to place, whether it is indeed sort of when do people make real decisions, when do they delay decision-making processes. But for instance, in Nijmegen, I was alluding to that, I think, already in my presentation, we have developed this thresholds approach, in which we look at, let's say, when people start to engage with migration. And one of the things that, Nijmegen, where I'm based, is right on the border with Germany. So if you ask our students about future employment opportunities, and you ask them, so what are you looking at? They'll mention all sorts of places in the Netherlands, but very few actually conceive that there's also this country, it's quite big, just across the border, that also provides them ample opportunity. That's because it's not in their cognitive reasoning to think of the opportunities that is available in Germany, right? Yep. So they just don't see it. So the question here is when we look at climate change as onsetting, when is it that the realization dawns, and when does it become, let's say, an act of choice to either remain immobile or rather to mobilize?
Can I just briefly say something in yeah, just because I find it interesting in our field, often those who stay often being phrased as staying behind, as if it's sort of inferior, and especially in relation to gender, that is increasingly also not so active yet, but it's coming increasingly up as a focus in the field. Then it's often sort of the women staying behind, and again also, of course, that is also to an extent the case, but it's very much also leads to this victimization and sort of the women as if only sort of the helpless, vulnerable staying behind, and others I think have been trying to therefore also show cases of the women actually moving, or when women are staying, how they are actually also taking ownership of particular adaptation actions. And I think there's also an article on the putting stayers in the spotlight, which is quite nice. So yeah, I agree with that point, and I think you see you're nodding. So I think you work on the gender dimensions, right? Yes. Yeah, maybe later.
Okay. Francis?
Maybe I'll just reserve it for the next point.
No, Francis, can I entice you to say a little bit about the happy moment which we've discussed, and then to look at the happy moment not as a moment of mobility, but as a happy moment of immobility, and maybe you need to sort of explain what it is about. But yeah.
Well, I think that whole idea of the happy moment concerns the fact that different factors intertwine to really cause someone to move. So when we look at mobility in relation to climate change, we also need to give attention to these other factors. And that was the moment where some young people who earlier wanted to migrate did not find the opportunity. But having been presented with a situation of poor harvest and that adversity of food insecurity, then they migrated to Accra. But their primary motivation was to really to know the city. And some young boys also wanted to find their girlfriends who had earlier migrated. So that was a beautiful moment. But what I also find interesting about Ingrid's presentation and also cuts across us is the fact that we all look at how people can use multi-sited, multi-spatial situations, have families relocate at particular moments, to really help in dealing with climate, various changes in the climate. But we probably do not talk about age dimensions when we also talk about gender, but we don't talk about age. And it's often so easily assumed that older people would stay home, would be immobile because of their lack of capacity in physical sense. But this is not the case in northern Ghana, as myself and Lothar found 7 years ago, that older people would migrate to make a farm and stay there, harvest, and then return. That's migration, it's seasonal migration. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Then I'll open up and get back to you, Ingrid, also, but let's hear from you. Any questions or comments?
Yeah, hello, I'm Jytte Agergaard, University of Copenhagen. And Francis, I was very intrigued by your paper for various reasons. One of them being that I've just been in Tumo, because our new project is actually trying to understand how Tumo and Narongo become center of attractions in rural areas. And sort of trying to understand sort of the climate change governance implications of these kind of sort of changes, you know, the most, you know, not so often talked about urbanization that actually do take place and might be the option both for local people to migrate to and also for return migration, just as you mentioned. And one of the issues that we started to sort of think about is actually also that these small towns actually make an option for women. So if we start to have a gender perspective on that, they might actually be the places where women can move to for various reasons, either married women, but also the lots of women who are not sort of in this kind of secure relationship with access to land. But what I was sort of, and what we also observe is, you know, this kind of returning funds. So you can see in the way that these towns are built, that we actually have a lot of these returnees coming to the places. Right, so my question to you was actually when you sort of look into sort of the importance of the returnees, looking for the good rain, and you sort of say that they do return, do they really return to the home or do they return to the region? Or how should we, you know, we have the whole discussion about the J-turn or the U-turn or whatever it is. So I'm just curious to know if a lot of these returnees, I assume with some funds, if they choose the village or they choose some, you know, more urban, not smarty, southern Ghana, urban kind of places to live in. So it's both of whether you make some of the same observations about gender, and the second question is basically about sort of this kind of idea of return or rural return migration. Make sense?
Sure. Yeah, that's a very important observation. And I have kind of realized from my focus group discussion and interviews that it's mostly talked about men going along with their wives and children. And the women would mostly stay close to Navrongo, where they go to the irrigation farms where they go to deal with the vegetables. And traditionally, singular or married women would not go that far by themselves. And some literature say this is old, but it's still happening. So I think also that most returnees today that I've spoken to who were once in the city have preferred to go back home in the village where they still have many of their colleagues and compatriots, where they can still have time and to enjoy their rural life. And some of these returnees have offered themselves to serve as assemblymen, assemblywomen, and they have really proven to be a great resource when it comes to local governance, because then they also come up with other ideas of land use. And I spoke to an assemblyman that's really having a hard time telling the villagers that they have to really preserve the valley for rice farming. But this other family is interested in selling it off just one time. So I think also that if people would be supported to settle in Tumu, I think many would really go, because even now many literates who are in who are in the what do you call it, bigger places of work, have farms in Tumu and other places like Bimbila where the rains really are much better, and they make quite a lot of money involving in agriculture. So if you look at the Ghana Gas Service, you would see that more than half of the urban households still maintain some form of agrarian livelihoods. Yes, and this is increasing over time. Oh, yeah. Yeah. I think that's a very important point. And even Tamale also has been the fastest growing city in West Africa for the last 10 years and receiving all kinds of migrants. So you see also that the patterns of migration concerning Kayaye, headquarters that we know in Ghana, now see Tamale as a hub. And some that were in Accra have also returned to Tamale because it is much easier to deal with their own people in Tamale. It's closer to the home. And with the COVID-19 lockdowns, many came to Tamale to then continue with their business and never returned to Accra, haven't seen the relative, the benefits that are there.
Neil, and then you afterwards.
Yes. Thanks very much. Excuse me. Thanks very much, and really interesting presentations, and really making me think a lot. But I have one thought, and just to address all of you with, actually, and that is, in this question of mobility, immobility, how much agency lies in that? And what I mean by that is how much is the agency operating in spaces shaped, not least, and this is where I come from, by the role of government and government policies. And I was just writing down a quick list here, and I wrote down education, health, roads, markets, water management, electricity, banks, credit. All of these, to some extent, are rooted in active or non-active policies on the part of government. But how much do they shape the decision-making and the agency of those that you're describing or looking at in these practices of mobility?
Yeah. No, thanks very much for that question. Obviously, it's a wicked question because because there's two major processes that are colliding in a way, right? So on the one hand, you could say there's the state, and I was alluding to that also in my presentation, I think, to some extent, saying where's the responsibility of the state and how far should it take responsibility, and is the modality of, for instance, providing education, providing health centers, providing all these basic amenities, is that enough to offset what is changing at the moment in a rural sort of landscape in which, for many, not so much the droughts, but the irregularity of rainfall is what's crucial. It's great to have education, but what does that bring us, right? So this is the key question. And I remember being at a conference in Jakarta, and one of my fellow presenters there was saying that maybe we should turn to vocational training. So maybe we should change what the kind of education we give and focus more on the opportunities that are present for people. But this, of course, is a huge question, because what it really says is you're not good enough to have formal education. We'll give you vocational education instead, right? So it's an ethical question of what education constitutes. And I think this is the harder question that governments need to face: is, are we looking at addressing an increasingly emergency kind of situation, or are we still able to look at sustainable transformations of societies that are no longer resting on the premises of a rural or an urban economy, but really sort of link up those two? And how do we then sort of, develop governance around that? I myself am not a big fan of the SDGs, because I think they're still very much, although less so than the MDGs, very much oriented on, let's say, sedentary economies and how to build policies around that. So, but that's where I stand. It's not an answer to your question, but it's just further reflection, basically. Sorry for that.
Yeah, I find it maybe a difficult question, because I haven't so explicitly thought about it. So I'm thinking about concrete case studies and how it came across there. So I find it hard to find a red thread in that, but maybe I can. But at least, for instance, in the Patagonia case study, where, for instance, it was actually the government who was pushing for a relocation of the village, and in sort of the analysis there came across that sort of on one hand a sort of a mistrust in governmental policies, but also a sort of an identity of independence, risk takers, as sort of the community themselves identified themselves, was rather maybe contributing to not wanting to relocate. But in another case, for instance, in Bangladesh, it seemed to be rather, for instance, gender norms that were quite influential, and I think somewhat less government or other governance strategies. There was, for instance, an area in Qutb Dia, which I found quite insightful, as there were not a lot of men, because a lot of men had, because of the seawater that you saw had destroyed a lot of the agricultural fields. So a lot of men became either fishers and were often away, or they had gone more often away for seasonal work, while the women and the children often stayed. And it was one of the few areas where, for me, it was very easy to talk with women, and women were very vocal and had a lot of ideas also about where they wanted to maybe, whether they wanted to stay or move away with their families. And also when the men returned, they still, the women remained sort of the key persons who were speaking and were sharing their ideas. And I was not used to that, as in other areas of Bangladesh, it was often the men going forward and sort of, and there appeared these gendered norms, and there, because it was a big women group, sort of it changed somewhat of the relations of who is actually the key decision making in the household, and enabled somewhat more of the agency basically for the women. So that was maybe an example of where I didn't see so much government, but more rather other sort of dynamics. But that sense, I don't really see red thread yet between the cases. But I don't know if this relates to what you were looking for.
Yeah, Shelter, was that a hand you had there? Yeah, please. And then
I'm Shelter. So the immobility and the voluntary and involuntary immobility, actually a part of my thesis is on that. And what I noticed was that it actually has to do a lot with cultural norms. Because in the Upper West region, the patrilineal system is much more dominant. So the men are encouraged to migrate, even though the women are now migrating. But when it comes to the Eastern region, it's in the forest zone. And that's very interesting, because the Eastern region in Ghana used to be, or it still is, one of the destination points for migrants. But that, of course, is changing because, as Francis mentioned, the migration patterns are being challenged and the already existing migration myths too are being disproven. In the eastern region, this particular village we went to and realized that the women were encouraged to migrate and the men were asked to stay back. That was the voluntary immobility. That was basically because of cultural norms. So the men, because they are the head and it's called akole, the men are asked to stay back, look after the family, look after their land, and the women are asked to come to the city to either probably get a husband, marry, and they can remit, send some money back home, or they'll come to the cities, look for jobs, and remit to the money back home. So this voluntary and involuntary mobility, per my focus group discussions and my in-depth interview, realized that it's an interaction with other factors. It has to do with social, culture, and political. Political in the sense of some of the structures put in place by the government, some of the initiatives. And we shouldn't also forget some of the women empowerment schemes that have come into play in this era, because you realize that some of the women are having the courage to disregard already existing cultural norms, especially in the Upper West region, because of women empowerment schemes, education. So now women with higher level of education, they just need probably JHS, or when I say JHS, that is the junior high school and the senior high school certificate. They don't even need to write the exams. The exposure, using the internet, seeing other women having forums like this, they have the courage to. So you realize that some of these social factors that are already existing is getting interplayed with, I don't know whether I should use the word modernization, and probably other schemes that have come into play that are targeting specific social groups like women, and also the intergenerational factor that Francis mentioned. You realize that in the eastern region, the older ones, of course, stayed behind, but the younger ones were encouraged to migrate. So the voluntary and involuntary, that's all I have.
And do you, 'cause I don't know so much about Ghana, but so you say that it differs a bit per region. Do you know then what the difference in the cultural norms are? Why in that eastern region, for instance, are more the women who are asked to migrate? And
eastern region practices both matrilineal and patrilineal systems. So the matrilineal system is where the mother side, the children inherit. So maybe a man dies. Majority of the inheritance goes to the sister's children. So there's some sort of traditional, for the lack of the better word, women empowered existing in the eastern region. So as compared to other places where patrilineal system is dominant, we have queen mothers taking decisions in the eastern region. We have women, because in the focus group discussion in the eastern region, the women were much more vocal per my observation. They were able to contest what the men were saying. There was a woman and a husband talking, just able to challenge what the husband was saying. So the eastern region already has this existing. There we have the matrilineal system, of course, existing in the Ashanti region, but my work doesn't focus on that. So I'm assuming probably, per basic analogy, probably find the same thing there. So it's basically about cultural norms. Yeah.
Francis, you want to respond to that first?
Well, I just take the question. Yeah.
You make many important points, and I'm trying to sort of establish where I want to respond, because there's so much to respond to. What I find compelling in particular is the argument of modernization. We use it hesitantly, but I think it's not unimportant, right? Because people themselves talk about modernization. It's not even our own language, but it's the language that is spoken. And what is important about that is a sense that somehow there's a difference between rural and urban that connects to whether you're part of a larger world or not. And I think that when situation aggravates, when situation becomes worse in a rural context, then this can precipitate this movement. And what Francis was already alluding to with the happy moment is exactly the sense of empowerment. So it's using a crisis, a environmental crisis of a kind, so a crop loss or whatever, to actually empower yourself to move somewhere else, to be able to take the chance. Now this is very much indeed in a patrimonial system that is the logic, and indeed amongst the airway it's a different story. And I don't think we should get into the technicalities of cultures at a local level, but I think what is important here is indeed a question of how on the one hand, we see soap operas on TV. We see things out in the world, but it doesn't make them real. The question is, when it does become real for people to reach out to it and allude to mobility as a choice, which is that it provides new opportunities. So I find the relevant connections very important. I've been in Ghana for a long time, and I remember when I was in 2003, when I went there, I used to have to go to an internet cafe myself in order to get my emails sent out. And I would be in the company of lots of young people who would never go to the cafe in their corner of the street, but always somewhere else for whatever reasons. But also they were always busy chatting to people elsewhere in the world. And I found that such a random act, because if you don't know who the other person is, what is the sense of that? Maybe I'm a very rational person and I shouldn't have thought along those lines, but let's leave it there. What is more important, I think, is the fact that this was about reaching out, right, and understanding modernization. So I think the question we need to ask ourselves is really, okay, so where does modernization come in already in the current, let's say, rural context that we're in? And where would it be an avenue to explore for understanding the continued relevance of these rural regions if the perception is maintained that rural regions are backward, essentially, are places of default and not places to be, right? And I think that is really the difference.
Yeah, and I think you also show indeed this point how what also the climate mobilities research is trying to do more, that we should interact and look more into these social factors that you point into, as that shapes very much mobility patterns and how it takes place, and it can vary depending on the context. And I think your work shows that really really well. Yeah, I found it very interesting.
Okay, thanks. And you and then Lily afterwards, and we group the last questions a bit and go on until around 4 o'clock maximum, 4:05.
Okay. Maybe my question is slightly outside the subject, but we are talking about climate change as well. So my big worry, at the same time as I was very pleased of what's going on in the Tumu area with the good rainfall and people moving to Tumu and so on, but I can't help being worried that there will be some kind of exploitation going on. I mean, you said something about the Chinese are moving in, and somehow the Chinese don't have the very best reputation, especially not in, well, that they might want to be sort of trying to exploit things. And then ultimately that would lead to migration again, because if the soil is exploited, that would lead to more. I mean, in Denmark, the way agriculture is done is some of the worst climate sinners. We're trying hard to change that. So are there any measures taken to sort of be respectful of the soil, of the people, and the trees? Yeah.
Okay, and then Lily, and then you, and then we go to Francis.
Thank you so much for all of your presentations. I wanted to ask about something that I think came out across them, and that was the way, I mean, Ingrid, you mentioned power and politics, and then in Lothar and Francis's presentations, you mentioned these as the politics and policies of it in Ghana, but also these kind of as a mobility regimes. And so what I'm very curious about, I mean, a lot of these things have come up in response to certain expectations of climate mobility. I'm wondering, in your work, in your data collection, how much you see these things now having effects on the ground and the interactions between these kinds of policies and regimes and mobility, and that could be in a variety of ways, also contestations or resistance. So just to understand how you might be seeing this already now.
Okay, so let's, we have those questions, and you, and then Adan afterwards, and maybe one more, and then we end and continue in the other room.
Yeah, I had one question for Francis.
Okay, so we take the and then Francis, there were several questions to you. So
so I wondered also in the context of the case of Tumu. is that because of climate change that it became sort of more rain-fed and attracted more people, or because some quote it also showed that it seemed to be a good place, had always been a good place, but just now became more accessible. So to what extent was climate change sort of a factor there or not? And also, as the reason as to why people moved away from other areas in the south of Ghana, to what extent was that about climate change, or was it sort of unrelated to that and other dynamics at play? And maybe in relation to the point on the Chinese, they are quite active with the Great Green Wall, right? And also in Africa. And I don't know. Is that Is that I don't know if that's. But maybe that's too much for now. But yeah.
Yeah, I think I probably did gloss over one of my PowerPoints, and in that I tried to explain that Tumu area had already been one of the greenest places in Ghana, preserved by the first president of Nkrumah, and it next to it is 2 big reserves. So the Mole game is very big, with at least 1,000 elephants and many impalas. Then we have another green belt reserve also surrounding the city, the big town of Tumu and its rural areas. So it has always been green and also had, enough time to recover from bushfires and others, unlike other places that were overused. So the point is that it was inaccessible for a long time because it was so thick in vegetation that there were many wild animals, that even people who went to Burkina Faso to buy cheap motorbikes and returned, some lost their lives to something that was eating them, but they were not sure what it was. Yeah, it jumps on the last person and then it takes him away or kills him there, because the first person had a gun, because they know what is how the security situation there. So, but the nice thing also about Tumu is that both the government and also commercial entities, some organizations are interested in a kind of green agriculture, so they might be able to sustain the soils. But we are also seeing serious agricultural extensification in Tumu, and mostly led by migrants. So this might lead to what we also then call maladaptation one day. So, well, we have to think around it. Then the Chinese, fortunately, have stopped cutting the rosewood in the forest reserve, and they did this through the help of Ghanaians who did not understand the real value of the rosewood, and also through the help of politicians. But it seems the deforestation from rosewood has stopped. Yeah. Finally, I think about politics around climate change adaptation. How is it already playing out at the local level? Little is playing out at the local level, because most of these policies have yet to find their way to be mainstreamed at the local level. So we're now having various programs to try to get local authorities to understand the concepts first, and how they then mainstream them into their medium-term development plans. A medium-term development plan for a district is like every 4 years, and it goes over. But I will tell you from experience that less than 20% of these plans are achieved, and then they just keep rolling them on.
Yeah, and just one small addition on the greenbelt, which you mentioned. I had a student do master research on this very recently in Nigeria, and what they said there, and I think that's what's of relevance, is that there's a difference between, let's say, being part of a program when it's already instituted, and when you still get the chance to conceive what is relevant. And here you really see that there's a strong hierarchy of policy between, let's say, what is enacted at national, even international levels, right? So it's this great ambition that we can all sort of side side with, because why would you want to have more Sahara and why wouldn't you want to have more green? But the way it's conceived, it just completely ignores the local actors and their knowledge. And I think that then sort of hardly stands a chance of being a success. And indeed, it gets contested for all the wrong reasons then because of this. So this is, I think, a critical note that we should take on board.
Yeah. Okay, then, yeah, do you want to?
I thought I should respond to her question.
Yeah, please.
Or you can also
No,
stop.
no, please.
Okay. Yeah, so with the politics indeed of adaptation, etc. What you often see is that I think the IOM is also a player in that, seeing migration as a form of adaptation and promoting that quite actively. And I think now also you have the climate mobility initiative in West Africa, I think, with a lot of big players being involved in that. And I think that narrative is also promoted there, fitting, of course, with a lot of mobile livelihoods that are there. There are also academics who critique it for being sort of a neoliberal type of discourse, putting a lot of responsibility with the migrant. But yeah, so there are, of course, always critical discussions. But I think for a large part, it fits with a lot of sort of the types of livelihoods that are there. What is interesting is maybe Kasia Paprocki's work in Bangladesh. She shows also how sometimes that narrative is also can also be misused. That, for instance, the World Bank they've been promoting for a long time there already a shift to shrimp farms in Khulna in the west of Bangladesh, and it led actually to a lot of displacement. And that's now had been in the recent years often been framed as, well, this area will be lost to climate change anyway, so best if they all migrate to cities, migration as adaptation, though actually had a lot to do also with a lot of economic interest and other things at play. And there's so it can be that's I think Kasia Paprocki's work is quite nice, and also being aware that it can also have be misused in some instances. Yeah. But
Okay, so the final question. So Adana, is anybody else? No, and then Jytte has an announcement of another very interesting. Should we start with you? Yeah.
It's just on that.
On
the 20th of June, we held another sort of lecture with discussions with Director Francis Giamene from the Hugo Observatory, and also the PI of the new Habitable. And he will hold a lecture on migrants are not props to alert about the dangers of climate change. And myself and, what's her name? I forgot it. Miriam Collin from the law department will sort of be discussing that. And that's on the 20th of June, 2:15 at Østervoldgade 10. But you're welcome to contact me and I will send around the invitation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for the wonderful presentations. So I would like to ask, at least 3 questions. I hope I will not take that much. The first one is the issue of this concepts that are being recurring in the study of climate change and migration, adaptive migration, climate migration, and so on. So can we, I want to hear your reflections on that. So can we use these terminologies or concepts without claiming for causal relationship between the two? Because now from the 3 presentations, I haven't seen any of you trying to come up with this, there is a direct linkage or so on. So climate change, migration, climate change contexts. So even in this case, how do we understand the role of climate change, compared to other factors?
Yeah.
And the second one is the issue of mobility, voluntary mobility, and trapped communities. So here, are we talking about, when we talk about voluntary immobility, are we talking about those with better adaptive capacity? So do they choose to stay because they manage to adapt? So how do we identify, basically from a methodological perspective, how do we differentiate that somebody is staying because that he can't or because he chose to? So the third is the issue of this politics in power. I think that needs to be explored because I am also interested on that from, since I am a political science student. I'm trying to understand how local governance institutions governing access, like land, finance, and jobs, are shaping climate change decisions. So from your perspective, like, what are really the roles at the local level especially? Because much is being said about global regimes and national policies and so on, but at the local level there is politics going on, not from government perspective, but there is power relations and other aspects like state and rural society relations. So from that perspective, like, which institutions do you think are either hindering or facilitating such kind of decisions, patterns and practices? Thank you.
Okay, great questions. I suggest you pick one each, and after that we say thank you to each other and head towards the small reception next door.
Ingrid, you start. Sure. Yeah. Sure.
Okay, so I do the first point. Yeah. So indeed, the debate on whether or not the relation is direct, that has been a very long debate, and I think more or less everybody in the community agrees that it's a sort of a multi-causal relationship, and indeed in that context, there have been also a lot of papers looking into different discourses and also critiquing the different concepts out there. And it moved indeed from first people used the term climate refugees, it got critiqued, and then it went to climate change related migration, and then now with climate mobilities, I remember also in our group we had the discussion, should we then call it climate mobilities or not climate related mobilities? And we had a big discussion on that, because in a sense mobilities as a concept from mobilities literature is in itself has a lot of complexity in there, and assumes that a lot of different types of sort of mobilities intersect. So from Uri and Scheller's work, etc. But we still wanted to also emphasize as a community that we look especially in how does this interrelate with climate change. So that's but I see what you mean. So I think this is sort of an ongoing sort of debate, and also but so that's a little bit how the debate is evolving and struggling sometimes a bit with the use of terms to be clear, at the same time knowing that the relations are indirect and multicausal. So not a clear-cut answer, but this gives maybe a bit of a picture of the debates out there. Yeah.
Francis, 2 or 3.
Well, maybe I jump around. I think really the lexicon of climate mobility nexus can be quite confusing, and I think sometimes you just have to look in between and take what fits most and what makes more sense to you. And also what I do is to try to stay safe, so I try to fall where there is more acceptability. But of course, if I got your other question right about politics and adaptation and how that might influence adaptation and probably mobility. Yes, of course. So now already in Ghana, we're seeing that different companies are trying to push the government to accept what they call improved seats. So they are on the trial phases, and the government gets this for free for some farmers, and then the next time they get it through a subsidy. So farmers are buying into it, and they are happy that they have big yields, high yields, and usually high yields. But there are all sorts of complaints about the taste of these seeds. And one man says, no, I can't give this to the gods, so the sacrifice cannot be made. They have to go and buy a real millet, real maize, to make the festival. So you see how culture also interplays with all kinds of climate adaptation. But then it also has to do with the money. Politics is just not enough. It's about the money and who is pushing what agenda from where.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to say. I think your 3 questions actually link up to each other, so they're not quite separable. What I tried to get across in my presentation, which I will then somewhat repeat here, is the fact that we need to look at climate change not only as a physical process, but also as one that's very much enmeshed in politics. And I think that's also what your 3rd question was about. And I think one of the things that I am concerned with, and I don't have a ready answer to, is understanding what global trade does for the way situations might aggravate in particular contexts. And this relates, on the one hand, for instance, to very sort of modernistic, technocratic kind of solutions for irrigation, for instance, but irrigation under certain conditions, right? So it needs to then be commercialized. It needs to be sort of put up at a scale. So that may not actually help local populations at all, because what you're getting is reduced employment rather than increased. So there's so much staging of the question in a way that understanding the measures which governments, for instance, would take needs to be taken with certain caution. And I think one of the questions that you see happening around the African continent, we seem to be speaking a lot about Africa today, is land tenure. And land tenure is a huge issue that is insolvable at the moment. We're seeing, particularly, of course, in the peri-urban zones where this is really played out, but it's also played out in other places. And this can actually lead to sort of really rapidly worsening situations for all sorts of populations. I think that the famous example we all know is of Maasai who have sold off their land in Kenya, who then find themselves landless in the city, involuntary mobile. Now, this is not about climate change, but climate change links up to this, right? So it's because of these worsening situations, you sell off your land more rapidly to get something else out of it. So that's why, this is why the causality question is such a complex question. Let me leave it there.
Thank you very much. Then before we close completely, I'll just make another announcement for another very interesting upcoming seminar. That's Wednesday next week on June 1st from 10 to 12 with Jesse Ribot, and the title is Climate Change is not the cause, migration is not the problem. So with this word, thank you so much to you, to our speakers, and this was so inspiring. We could have gone on talking and discussions, but now we can do that next room. Thank you so much.